Good afternoon. I think we can begin. Let me start by pointing out that the lecture will be recorded and put out on YouTube. The Q&A session will not be uploaded. My name is Zsolt Enyedi. I am a researcher at the Democracy Institute at the De-Democratization and Redemocratization Working Group. And actually, this is the working group that organized this event. So we are at a group event now, but it is open to the public. We will have many such events in the future. The next one will be actually tomorrow. But let me introduce now our today's speaker, Dorit Geva. Many of you know her, so I don't have to go into details, but she's a professor of sociology at CU, and she's also the Dean of Undergraduate Studies. She has got her PhD at NYU. She was a fellow at EUI and University of Chicago, and works on many exciting issues such as military service, gender, radical right, welfare policies, and so on. She's also a great expert of French and Hungarian politics, and I think this expertise will come handy today when she will present her lecture on globalist illiberals. Dorit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsolt. It's really a pleasure to be here. I had hoped to be able to give a talk at the Democracy Institute in person, but as we all know, that wasn't possible. But in any case, it's very nice to be here. The talk that I'm giving today is my attempt at trying to link two different papers of mine, where I'm trying to piece together different chronological moments and gesturing at a bigger development that I started identifying kind of by mistake in 2013, and I'll talk about that in detail, and which has gained force, I think, in current times. So the first article is a 2019 article called No au Gender, Moral Epistemics and French Conservative Strategies of Distinction, which is in the European Journal of Cultural and Political Sociology. And then the second I would like to emphasize is a co-authorship, an article that I wrote with Dr. Felipe Santos, who was a CEU graduate and now a postdoc at City University London, an article that we published in International Affairs called Europe's Far-Right Educational Projects and Their Vision for the International Order. And what I tried to trace here in linking these two research pieces is to try to identify a sweep of radicalization of conservatism, and also really understanding epistemic politics and universities in particular as increasingly important sites for this radicalization of conservatism and a joining of a bridging of far-right ideology with traditional conservatives. So I'm going to begin with describing a bit of where I was in 2013 when I actually kicked off my research on the far right. So in March of 2013, I headed to France to start a new research project on the gender politics of the French National Front, which is now renamed the Rassemblement National, but at the time was the FN. It was starting to change and grow in popularity following the election of Marine Le Pen as the new party president the year before. So I'm a political sociologist, as was introduced by Zsolt, which means essentially that I study politics outside of formal institutions. I'm just as interested in or I would even say more interested in the social formations that determine politics, and also vice versa, more so than formal institutions. And so this was a very political sociological project. It was ethnographic and also based on interviews. And I mainly based myself in the southeast of France. So you can feel sorry for me. I was basically in Provence in the French Riviera, but that is the historic core of, it's the historic heartland of the French radical right, of the French National Front. Now, let me give a little bit of a very brief history of the party. The French National Front, was founded in 1972. And in terms of the social class that it emerged from, it really emerged from the Pujadiste movement, which was essentially a tax revolt of small business people and artisans who were revolting against national tax policy that they argued really favored large capitalist enterprises. And so really mirroring Marx's classic account of petty bourgeois support for Bonapartism in the 19th century, the Pujadiste movement of the 1960s in France, and then its transition into Europe's first formal radical right party in the early 1970s, the Pujadiste movement was really based in the petty bourgeoisie. And under the leadership of its first president and longstanding president, Jean-Marie Le Pen, this was the solid social basis of the party for decades. So by petty bourgeois, I mean small enterprises or independent business people who handle commodities on a very small scale. And so what also conjoined from the emergence of the French National Front from the Pujadiste movement in the southeast of France was it also conjoined then with racial politics and anti-immigrant politics following the mass migration of white French citizens from former French Algeria, who largely settled in this southeastern rim, in the Mediterranean rim of France. And they too were often petty bourgeois citizens. So the social basis of the party in its origins remained petty bourgeois, and it conjoined with this anti-state, slightly anti-large enterprise ideology, and also colonial registers of racism and anti-Arab and then eventually anti-Muslim sentiment. And this was pretty solid within the party for decades. There were always some intellectuals at the margins of the party, and there were alternative far-right intellectuals. Probably the best known of these is Alain de Benoist and the founding of what became known as the Nouvelle Droite, or the New Right, in late 1960s and 1970s France. But this stream of far-right intellectualism really distanced itself actually from formal party politics. They never saw them, they never identified strongly and even distinguished themselves from the French National Front. They were anti-liberal, anti-American, and also sharply criticized economic liberalism and even anti-Catholic elements of it. They did focus on creating think tanks. So there was a world of, there was even a very important think tank. And they were certainly engaged in some ways with the world of ideas. But it remained quite separate from the politics, from the official party politics of the French National Front. So when I entered into France and into the milieu of the French National Front decades later, so this is in 2013, I found that I was studying this aging petty bourgeois base of a party that was trying to be modernized by Marine Le Pen, and really actually was to a large degree modernized by her. But it so happened that just when I arrived in France, so again, this was about March 2013, a new movement had suddenly emerged, and it seemed like it had emerged out of nowhere, and that was La Manif pour tous. This was the mobilization against legalization of same-sex marriage, which really caught France and I think a lot of the world by surprise. The movement translates roughly into Movement for All, which was meant as a direct repost to the proposed law to legalize same-sex marriage, which had been introduced by the socialist government, which was in power at the time. And that law was called the Marriage for All. Initially, so I was entering into the field as a qualitative researcher, basically trying to grasp whatever connections I can, make whatever networks of trust I could gain. And I very mistakenly thought that Les Manifs pour tous would be a gateway into the French National Front. So I started attending, so at the same time as I was really trying to enter into the milieu of the French National Front by going to party events and local offices in the Southeast, I kept on getting on the train to head to Paris on the high-speed train, which was the center of the Manifs pour tous, joining as many events as I could, rallies and organizational events and vigils of a related student movement called Les Veilleurs, which means the watchmen. And I began seeing, and so you have to remember that this is about March of 2013, I started seeing the language of mobilizing against the ideology of gender, which was always in English, so gender, not genre, but gender. I was totally perplexed. I mean, so by now we have, I think, of course, a much stronger understanding of where this was coming from, but I just couldn't understand it. And also I couldn't understand why such well-dressed, obviously very bourgeois, even more than bourgeois people were protesting against gender on the streets of Paris, and sometimes in Paris's most upscale neighborhoods. People who kept on insisting when I would talk to them that they had nothing to do with the French National Front, that they weren't the far right. So let me just very quickly, I don't want to actually keep the images on too long because I don't want to be a little square, but I did want to share with you a picture so you can see the just, you know, the type of sign that I was seeing that really was causing me a lot of puzzlement. So that this was just from a rally, one of the several Manifs pour tous rallies that I was attending at the time, these kind of hand-scrolled posters against gender. Okay, I'm not going to keep it on the PowerPoint because I don't want to be a little square, except that I have to stop share. Okay. So what began as what I thought was one research project in the early spring of 2013 ended up becoming two research projects because I found myself studying the Manifs pour tous, and I found myself studying the French National Front. So these were it became two research projects on two distinct political projects. But what appeared to be two political projects in 2013, since then has been merging into one political project. So in a very piecemeal way, I'm trying to piece together a little bit this transition from 2013 to where we are now. Because the mobilization against the Manifs pour tous, the Manifs pour tous mobilization, which was also an anti-gender mobilization, it was arguably the mobilization that kicked off the global phenomenon. It kicked off the phenomenon within Europe and also around the world. And I also found myself studying very educated conservatives, in some cases, people from very elite old Catholic families. And this was a completely different social milieu from the party activists. So I'm not talking about voters, I'm really talking about activists. So the milieu of the activists I was studying within the French National Front was totally different. So let me I want to talk about now a little bit about the Manifs pour tous. In the midst of attending these events in Paris, a chance encounter also really led me to some of the core organizers of the movement. I should say that it helped a lot that I'm Canadian. I didn't expect that. I think anybody who wants to do ethnography in France should say they're Canadian, but in my case, it's true because it really opened doors. There was sort of an automatic feeling of fraternity. So I think I was quite lucky in that way. And I attended in that spring of 2013 an event which I thought would have nothing to do with the Manifs pour tous. It was an event at the EHESS. It was a conference. But it was at the time that the Manifs pour tous events mobilization was at its height. But it was a conference called Beyond Marriage at the EHESS. So that's the École des Études en Sciences Sociales, which is a very prestigious postgraduate school of social sciences. And the focus was on rethinking marriage and the law in light of legalization of same-sex marriage. And it had some of the best known intellectuals in the field in France, like Eric Fassin and so on. So when I walked in, the mood was palpably tense. Normally an ÖSS audience would have been just by default supportive of legalization of same-sex marriage. But amongst the audience, having what felt like breached the gates of the ÖSS to attend the event, there were several Manifestus activists who had gotten word of the conference, which had billed itself as open to the public. It was what was pasted on the posters at the entrance to the building, and really breaching norms of conduct, but I think also breaching the norms of the silent structures of authority in a university hall. They were asking provocative questions at the end of each panel and recording with their phone the proceedings. And this generated a lot of anger and shouts and hissing and people calling them fascists and asking them to leave. It was a very tense environment. It was a real crisis in the moment. So really there was a feeling that something had been breached. So I decided to approach the activists during the break, who were very conservatively, finely dressed white men in their 30s, what looked to me to be in their 30s. And I approached a man whom I'll call Alexandre, so I'll use a pseudonym. And I explained to him, I'm a researcher, I'm a sociologist, I'm a Canadian, I don't understand what you are. And he said, okay, meet me for a coffee. So a week later, we met in a very posh neighborhood in Paris, in central Paris, for a morning breakfast. He was dressed in a very fine conservative suit because he was going afterwards to his high prestige job in La Défense. He worked in the aeronautics industry. And I listened to him. I spoke very little. I was really perplexed at the time and had difficulty making sense of who he was, and what he was doing. And I listened for a long time. It was about 2 hours. In this discussion, Alexandre described to me his frustrations with how Le Manifestus was being represented in the media. So let me just share again the screen, and maybe at this point I'll just keep it so I don't have to keep on interrupting myself. So I can read out the quote more clearly to you. Okay, so this is what he said. I don't like the arrogance of intellectuals. They constantly refer to me and other activists as fascists, extremists, homophobic, and the media too emphasizes that. And it's a caricature of who we are. We're not violent. If at all, we're more open to gays than the gay movement itself. And then interestingly, he said to me, and I had asked nothing about his education. He said, I wasn't educated at a fancy university, but at a school of commerce. But still, I'm not stupid. Now, in fact, Alexandre had attended an elite school of commerce, one of the grandes écoles, which are considered the most elite institutions in France. But what was interesting to me was and really puzzled me at the time, was his spontaneous reference to his education when speaking of his activism against same-sex marriage and also against the ideology of gender. I hadn't asked him any questions about his education. And he expressed a status anxiety, which at first glance seemed irrelevant to what he claimed was above all his moral opposition to same-sex marriage and to the ideology of gender. So importantly, his criticism was pointedly against intellectuals and elite universities. Through him, I was allowed entry into, he connected me. It was basically sort of a key person. He really opened the gates for me to connect to some key activists behind the movements. And I entered into the world of wealthy, educated, sometimes old Catholic families with enormous cultural capital and also in some cases financial capital. They were adamant that they were not far right and could not be lumped in with the French National Front. And what I understood from these activists, in which I analyze in detail in my 2019 article, but I should say that I don't know if I've ever written an article with which I struggled more in terms of the content of the interviews to really try to make sense of it. What I came to eventually understand, and I'm really kind of cutting to the chase here, is the Catholic conservatives, and I don't mean intellectuals, because these weren't professional intellectuals, but these were very educated conservatives who like to think of themselves as people who think a lot. They were thinking activists. that they care a lot about the world of ideas, and they care a lot about the status of the university. Central to this is the place of the university as an institution that is an intellectual, political, and moral authority. And for these specific actors, gender was a crucial battleground, not only as a moral crusade, not only because they were engaged with what they viewed as protecting the heterosexual family and the sanctity of heterosexual marriage, but because it was an idea produced in universities. And it was a rival gender, and what they call the ideology of gender, introduced a rival set of ideas produced by secular intellectuals who, in their view, had unfair advantages in the current structure of knowledge production in the secular public sphere, and whose ideas could have far-reaching consequences for law and politics. So my article traces in detail the range of criticisms they launched against concepts like gender ideology, what they call the LGBT lobby, and similar ideas. But what I pull together as lessons learned from these interviews are three aspects I want to emphasize here. The first is that educated Catholic conservatives respect universities as institutions that not only produce ideas, but crucially as institutions that confer status. They take education and literally the degrees, the pieces of paper that they confer very seriously. So they simultaneously criticized universities for production of irresponsible ideologies like gender ideology. But at the same time, they all had university degrees, and many would emphasize to me when I never asked that they had graduated from elite institutions. From a purely class analysis perspective, these are actors whose legitimacy in the public sphere and even their value in the market depends on universities. And relatedly, they see institutions, they understand universities and the production of ideas as really crucial sources of power, and sources of power and influence in the Republic. And the third argument, which is a little more complicated, but I think is really important and which we're seeing more and more of today, is their idea that conservatives, not secular thinkers, that conservatives today are the keepers of the original values of the European public sphere, of the modern European public sphere. And I can share multiple quotes and observations, but if you really want, you can look back at the article to see more, but let me just try to describe the point. And this is how the argument goes. The secular public sphere was premised on the idea that intellectuals, the producers of ideas, are autonomous. That is, that they're not forced to produce or reproduce ideas that represent the authority of an institution, especially the Catholic Church, specifically in France. Sociologists of knowledge call this the argument of epistemic autonomy versus epistemic heteronomy. Heteronomy being a condition in which one lacks moral or intellectual autonomy. Catholics, and generally conservative figures whose ideas have some relation to organized religions, are viewed as suspect within the secular public sphere due to their perceived epistemic heteronomy, i.e. their inability to think or produce ideas through a self-determinative and autonomous process of intellectual production, of epistemic production. And so religious intellectuals and conservatives who associate themselves with religious ideas have long had to traverse a liminal space in a secular public sphere in which their ideas have been suspect or lesser valued because their ideas are viewed as produced within a theological position that limits the scope of ideas that can be considered. But what I found really fascinating and took me a long time to make sense of was that these conservative Catholic actors in 2013 were turning this argument exactly on its head. And this is, I think, really crucial to understand where we are today. They claimed that unlike the secular world of gender ideologues or the LGBTQ lobby, it was their ideas that were now thoughtful and multifaceted and autonomous at the same time as they were classic, timeless, and universal. In other words, they turned the argument of heteronomy or the criticism of heteronomy against them exactly on its head. And the language of ideology is crucial here. So whether it's the trope of cultural Marxism or the ideology of gender, or increasingly as we see the language of political correctness or thought police, this is a critique which claims that conservatives are now the real bearers of the classic European public sphere and occupy the purer position of thinkers who are open to free thinking. And the secular left, whether it's the so-called cultural Marxists, the politically correct, the gender ideologues, the various lobbies, the secular left and the universities that represent it are now structured by conservatives as thinkers who are heteronomous. These are thinkers who are limited by their intellectual horizons in which free thinking, the ability to dare, is no longer allowed. This was my takeaway from this research in 2013. It was a social movement. But I guess in retrospect, it was only a matter of time when before these growing forces would shift from movements to institution building and a full assault in some cases on higher education where possible, or at least, as I'll emphasize a bit more now in France, some experimental projects, higher education projects. And Hungary has certainly been at the forefront of this. Let me just look at the time. Okay. So here I'm shifting to my more recent article with Felipe Santos, the International Affairs one, where we focused on new higher education projects that really tried to create a new kind of university and a new world of higher education in Europe. But I'm not going to discuss Hungary in detail, although I'm happy to during the discussion. I just suspect that with this audience, I don't really need to discuss Hungary that much in detail. I'll speak a little bit more about France with some quick references to Hungary. And of course, we can return to discussing Hungary during our discussion. I'm going to end with some, I think, comparative gestures, or at least questions that could be conducive to a discussion. So moving to what happened in France. While I was studying the French National Front in 2013, a prominent person of increasing importance within the party was the niece of Marine Le Pen, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, who since dropped Le Pen from her last name, so she now just goes by the name Marion Maréchal. Marion Maréchal, I think, is a really crucial figure for understanding the increased or this convergence, or the possibility of convergence between traditional conservatives and the far right. She is what could be called a bridge figure, and I use the concept of bridge figure from the work of an intellectual historian called Camille Robčič, who talks about figures who are really crucial in who are not necessarily themselves intellectuals. They don't hold university positions necessarily, but they can be really crucial in linking institutions and ideas in practice on the ground. So I think Marion Maréchal is such a bridge figure. Her own sociological profile is absolutely not petty bourgeois. She is a figure who, so she's the granddaughter of the Le Pen dynasty. So she is far-right royalty. She grew up in the western suburb, essentially the western suburbs of Paris, which is one of the conservative even aristocratic, certainly high bourgeois epicenters of France. She had a Catholic education, so she did not attend a secular secondary school. She went to a Catholic secondary school, and initially started studying law at one of the Parisian law faculties, which is prestigious and also has an important cluster of conservative intellectuals. Several, not a lot, but several of the many people whom I had interviewed had been graduates of this specific law school. When I was in France in 2013, she was a member of parliament. She was a member of the National Assembly, and she was a sensation within the party because she was the granddaughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen. She was the niece of the new party president. She was also the youngest person in French history to have been elected to the National Assembly. The person who held that record before her was her grandfather. She represented the FN in the town of Carpentras in the southeast. This is a traditional stronghold of the FN. I even managed to interview her at the time, but I won't actually talk about the interview now. She already was showing signs of chafing against the politics of her aunt, whom she has viewed as, and has publicly articulated, but in a very quiet criticism, that her aunt, Marine Le Pen, is not socially conservative enough. So Marion Maréchal considers herself to be a social conservative and to carry Catholic values. What was interesting and surprising in 2017, after Marine Le Pen lost the presidential elections, was that she announced quite suddenly her decision to leave politics and to leave the French National Front, to drop the Le Pen name, and to embark on a new project. And that project was establishment of a new institution of higher education in Lyon called ISEP, and which later, more recently, opened a branch in Spain, and which is trying to open other branches elsewhere. She's even had discussions of opening something like that in Budapest, though I think it's a quite saturated market already in Budapest. So it stands in English for the Institute of Social Sciences, Economics, and Politics. Lyon itself was an interesting choice. It's not where she's from, but it has a long tradition of being the center of Catholic conservatism in France. So it's kind of the conservative Rome of French Catholicism. So I think strategically it was a very deliberate choice on her part. So as I said, it also opened in Spain afterwards. These are both institutions, the Lyon institution and also the Spanish institution are struggling. So I don't want to create the impression that these are projects that are destined to succeed. They don't have state funding. They struggle with accreditation. But the ambition is certainly there to create a new kind of higher education institution in France. The goal right from the beginning was clearly to train a new class of right-wing leaders to be a center of intellectual production with influence in politics and economy. But also interestingly, there are courses in wine appreciation, in dancing, so also to produce a kind of refined bourgeois citizen. So in the paper, in the developed paper, in the bigger paper, we compare ISEP to the National University of Public Service Ludovica in Hungary, which was established by Viktor Orbán in 2012. And clearly Ludovica has considerable more state resources and the full force of the Orbán regime behind it. And there are differences between the institutions. I'm not going to tease them out here for the sake of time. Again, happy to talk about it if it's of interest afterwards. But what Felipe Santos and I discern from both projects is a commitment to what we call globalist liberalism. So here we see a shift, a I forgot to make an important, just one sentence I should have said earlier, is that what's really interesting in tracing Marion Maréchal Le Pen, or just Marion Maréchal now, and which I think is significant, is her decision to leave party politics and to focus on a higher education project as the weight of her essentially political activism. With this, to institutionalize the ideological link, the political link, and the sociological link between the traditional strongholds of the far right in France and the Catholic conservative bourgeoisie. So with ESEP and also the Nux Ludovica project, we look at what we do in the project is we look at the curricula, at the founding principles, the mission, the professors, some of the articles, intellectual production, journals, and so on. ESEP also has a think tank associated with it. And what we argue is that they despite their differences, what can be discerned is what we call globalist liberalism, which sorry, let me just put my last slide here. Now globalism, let me try to give a quick account of that. We take that term from the work of intellectual historian Quinn Slobodian, who wrote a very fine book, in my view, called The Globalists, which is an intellectual history of the founding of what he calls the globalist neoliberal institutions that police world markets since the post-war order. So the most important of which are the IMF and the World Trade Organization. And what he traces is a multi-generational project which starts in Vienna with figures like Hayek and von Mises, what became known afterwards as the Austrian School of Economics, whose economists who were in Vienna with the fall of the Habsburg, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And these economists lamented the imposition of national borders and national sovereign borders within a political and geographic and economic space that had once been the space of empire, which in their nostalgic view had been a space of free trade, of open borderless free trade. This was a group, so this was a university project, it was an intellectual project, it's a department building project. They crossed the pond. This is a project which then moves to the United States. It becomes central to the founding of very influential departments of economics, international relations, even political science at the height of American world hegemony. It gets transferred onto, so it's a multi-generational story, and becomes the blueprint for the Washington Consensus, and also some of the founding ideals of what is ultimately the World Trade Organization and the IMF, with the nostalgia, but behind it, the nostalgia of an idealized nostalgia of a borderless free trade space in the former empire. So the globalists, what we take from the concept of globalism is that it's pro-market, has a very, according to Slobodian, a very ambivalent relationship to democratic institutions. So the globalists, according to Slobodian, just accepted pragmatically that they had to accept democratic governance, but were not particularly devoted to democratic ideals. They just accepted as a kind of political compromise. that in order to try to at least effect a space, as wide a space as possible of free trade, of their idealized capitalist free trade zone, they would have to accept some level of democratic governance. But they remained deeply suspicious of nationalism and national borders. So what we argue in this paper, I mean, we don't say that, you know, that figures like Marion Maréchal or Viktor Orbán see themselves as direct, as sort of the next generation, but that they do actually accept certain aspects of pro-market ideology. These are certainly not anti-capitalist actors. That they see universities and university projects is actually quite important as a locus of power, and also a way of producing elites, political elites, and intellectual elites to spread their ideas. But there are a few important breaks. And a key break is, of course, the embrace of nationalism. And also a more ordoliberal tendencies. So a vision of this, so pro-capitalist, but a vision of a strong state that needs to steer capitalist markets. And in addition, a very strong criticism of liberal cultural values. So they strive against what they view as to be a libertarian, valueless, and borderless world without the correct moral and racial boundaries. And I think importantly, they link it with a radicalized Christian democracy. And this version of Christian democracy doesn't only emphasize the Christian democratic principle of subsidiarity, which in its original conception was very tightly linked to a Catholic vision of the family, an organicist concept of the family as the core of political society. So they do sustain still, of course, an emphasis on the family, but it had a much more explicitly heterosexual emphasis. But furthermore, they've incorporated the nation as a subsidiary organic unit, which is the basis of political society in Europe. And through this radicalized conception of national subsidiarity, are aiming to remake the European Union project in their image. I think this is even more evident actually with the Nux Ludovica, with the National University of Public Service project, and the Europe of Nations program within it. So they're trying to change European institutions from within by creating new universities and training new elites, by creating schools of higher education aimed at training professionals for the private sector, but also public service who represent their values. So they link a radicalized Christian democracy and hyper-nationalism, and they weave it into a pro-state, a pro-strong state, an ordo state, with a pro-market ideology that argues for barrier-free trade within Europe, but with a strong nationalist state steering the nation's competitiveness in global capitalism. So I think I've spoken. Okay, I'll wrap up here just with a few final comments. I think this is where we are historically, and I'll conclude with a few brief thoughts. What seemed to me in 2013 like one social movement of conservatives angling for intellectual and ideological supremacy by turning the tables on the secular university has actually turned out to be a significant institutional and political project. And in fact, actually in 2013, I just didn't quite understand it. It was already underway in Hungary because Nux Ludovica was founded in 2012. But these trends have only gained force. bridge figures like Marion Maréchal, but I think also, this new figure that we see in French politics, Éric Zemmour, are creating an institutional and ideological link between conservatives, especially Catholic conservatism and far-right ideology. And I think Viktor Orbán has been doing this too. Let's just also pause for a moment and consider that his, well, the political speeches, the political speech of the year, the world now awaits for every year is at a so-called summer university, which is actually very peculiar if one thinks about it historically. And universities and higher education projects are a plank in this radicalized conservatism, this merger between economic liberalism, conservative social values, racism, and a redefined Christian democracy, which centers the nation and not just the heterosexual family at its core. The recently announced University of Austin project in the United States is another example, probably, of such a project popping up, and a lot of the discourse sounds very similar. But here I'll just finish with some questions. It's questionable whether some projects can succeed outside political cultures where Christian democracy has played a central role. So I think this is really a question for further consideration. I don't have an answer. I'm finishing with a question. Does Catholicism, especially in Christian democracy specifically, create the institutional and ideological environment for a veneration of hierarchical knowledge, or veneration for universities, which today has made universities a Trojan horse for radicalized conservatism? I'll end there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I think it was a great presentation for a number of reasons. On the one hand, you gave us an insight into how the fieldwork has developed. You have given us very counterintuitive results. I mean, typically the illiberal projects are associated with lack of education, lack of interest in education. You have drawn a link between the movement that you have studied many years ago and recent developments, partly in Hungary and partly in some other countries. And you have shown that some of these initiatives are actually international initiatives, like in case of Lyon School, bridging Spanish-French audiences. So I think you have changed quite a bit our typical vision of the conservative, anti-liberal radicals.